Okay. Yeah,
Okay.
that sounds great.
Yeah. So, I mean, my first question was, it really is the biggest thing. Is there are so many, every day you hear about another diet. You follow Instagram and, the world that I'm in, the world that you're in, all we see is feeds on, different workout exercises and different diets. And, there's so much information out there. How do how do you disseminate that? How do you make a choice?
Yeah, that's such a good question. So important. I really think that social media is kind of like the phrase, the two-edged sword, I guess is what you would call it, or the double-edged sword, I
Double-edged
should
sword, yeah.
say. Where, on the one hand, you have access to a lot of resources and experts that you maybe would have never had access to unless you were attending a conference or you were able to go to to a university where you could hear the person speak. So there's plenty of experts there, but there are also, unfortunately, a lot of people sharing misinformation, and it might come with the good intentions of trying to help somebody, but in reality, it's not offering the level of science-based detail that needs to accompany diet recommendations. And so with the sound bites that we get on social media, it can be a challenge to understand what actually applies to you as an individual, but also how to use that information in a way that is beneficial, and also, is it even factual? So, I think that I often say with social media, when you're sharing health information, it can be a public health message, and with that comes responsibility. And so I do think that people who share their information on Instagram or Twitter, who maybe don't have the experience or the education to be doing so, could unintentionally be causing real harm, and that's an issue. So when I make the recommendation about how you can identify if something is really worth paying attention to, there's always that basic understanding that, there are experts in the field. So you're looking for experts in the field. So people who have the education and the training, who have, the years of experience to be talking about nutrition and food. And that might be dietitians, it might be, professionals in the nutrition field that have other certifications, PhDs, that's getting a little bit more confusing, only for the fact that there's a lot of weekend certifications that people can get now and call themselves nutritionists. And unfortunately, you really have to do some digging to know if the person actually has the depth of education that you really should be looking for when you're trying to understand if you should gather nutrition information from that person.
Mm-hmm.
So I would start with that. I think that's really a good place to look. And then, the second piece of this is that a lot of the common threads of nutrition and education around nutrition they haven't changed that much. So sometimes when you have somebody sharing information that's saying, oh, this is really, everything is wrong, like that sort of message, and then they're trying to sell you something that they're saying is right. That's a big red flag.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anytime it's kind of this sort of flipping everything on its head as if they've discovered this new, it's going to cure all of your things that ail you, that's definitely a big red flag. And I think that most people can identify that pretty quickly. And then I also think that you have to take your individual needs into account. So if somebody is sharing information, it doesn't matter if it's necessarily something that could be 100% based in science. If you can't apply it to your daily life, then that's not necessarily going to be appropriate for you either. So it is trying to figure out all of those layers and taking the information through a filter and multiple layers to understand how you can actually apply it to your own day in and day out approach. So, the quick fixes, the supplements, the extreme claims, all of these things that, and I say supplements, in a way of, I want to make sure that it's known that supplements can have their place in some cases, but when somebody's requiring them or selling them as a part of a program, that's that's a red flag. You know, so I think that it's a case by case. There's a lot of unfortunate scenarios where people think that there are absolutes in nutrition, and sometimes there just aren't. Sometimes it is it depends conversation, and it's not as cut and dry as some people want it to be. And so, you know, that is another example of a way that you can help to kind of sift through those experts per se in the field that maybe are not necessarily going to be applicable to what you need.
Yeah, that's great advice, and it makes a lot of sense. Even with that, excuse me, even with that though, you know, even taking the social media aspect out of it, there's always conflicting information, even if you're watching a Netflix special or you're reading the New York Times. You know, there's one month it's, you know, carbohydrates are good. Next month, carbohydrates are bad. You know, one month, you know, egg whites are the best thing in the world. Next month, egg whites are not the bad thing. There's so much back and forth on this. It's a challenge for some people to really find what works. And I guess that's where people like you come in, right? I mean, that's where the expertise and tailoring it to individuals kind of makes sense. Am I correct on that?
Definitely. It has to be an individual approach. And unfortunately, with the way media works today, we are constantly bombarded with headlines and snippets, and independent of social media. So as you mentioned, just in the news, Netflix, documentaries, information is always being thrown at us. And a lot of times it can be exaggerated, or there's an elaborative approach to it that is meant to get you to click on the headline or, you know, share the information. And it's maybe misinterpreting the studies, or the headline is based off of a single study, or it's based off of an animal study, which these things, when you think about the totality of the evidence and the quality of studies in nutrition science, it can be really challenging to find the core threads that go through the nutrition science based off of single studies. There's a lot of single studies in nutrition, but it's when you add them together and you look at the quality of the study, the size of the studies, you know, how long have we been looking at the interaction of a specific food and health outcomes and populations that are eating in certain ways, and what does that look like over time? You know, nutrition science is, it's very rare that you can actually take somebody and put them into a chamber and measure every single thing that they're eating and then measure their outcomes, because you have to think about nutrition science as it's a living science that we see effects over time. So, you know, it's much more difficult to say specifically that single foods are going to have or cause specific outcomes. So, like as an example, let's say you read a headline that says one food causes X outcome, whatever that outcome might be. That word cause should be a big red flag, because there might be an association, there might be a correlation, but very rarely are we finding that specific foods are causing outcomes. And it's because of all of the other factors that play into our lifestyles and our diets and our habits that we have a very hard time drawing that causation. And that line can be very difficult to put with one thing causing another when it comes to nutrition. So, you know, I think the common themes and the messages that we know around food and nutrition that have to do with healthy eating patterns and diet patterns over time, that's where the things don't change as much as the headlines would have you believe that they change. There's definitely going to be new science and new conclusions all the time, but it's not as significant as some of the like clickbait headlines might have you believe.
Right.
So
which is, that's good to hear from you, right? So that we don't have to, you know, panic when we see, you know, a headline. We can realize that maybe these things contribute to things, but they're not the causation of a lot of these things that they claim to be. So that's great news.
Yeah. And unfortunately, I think the headlines in this instance often create distrust in the nutrition science, which is not good. So then you start to have these offshoots of diet extremes in a response to maybe a series of headlines over time that were not necessarily the most appropriate interpretations of the study or studies that they were trying to demonstrate. So I think this is kind of one of the root causes of why you end up with so many different sort of approaches to eating and almost diet extremes. I don't know how else to put it, because sometimes I think that it's a response to not trusting the information that's coming out, or believing that the information is changing so significantly that we need to almost reject it completely. And that's not the way it should be either. So it can sometimes create a perfect storm that isn't necessarily the most positive when it comes to how people are actually eating, because you create this sort of dichotomy of an either or, and that's not great when it comes to nutrition.
Yeah, and I think to your point a little earlier too, is you add the other two factors in, that on one side, a lot of people are trying to profit from a certain diet or a certain supplement or a certain, eating style, if you will, diet. And then other people are looking for the panacea. They're looking for that magic pill that's going to, make them lose the weight or be healthier, or, so they're always looking for that. And those two things can be problematic, right? If someone's selling the magic pill and someone's looking for the magic pill, whether it's really the magic pill or not, which we know there is no magic pill, they're going to be attracted to it. And so that causes problems. So,
yeah. And unfortunately, I think with everything that's going on, I've already seen so many examples of people trying to sell diet pattern, or diets, I should say, as a means to help treat specific conditions or prevent those, in the instance of what's going on today with COVID. And that is scary.
Yeah.
Because we know there is no single food that is or way of eating that's going to prevent coronavirus of what we're seeing now. And so I think that's really key to say. But yeah, it's definitely a very lucrative business for some people to sell diets and sell diet books and supplements that go along with those, and claim to have the cure-alls. Lots of money to be made in that field for sure.
Because everybody wants to be healthier. Everybody wants to look better. Everybody wants to be, fitter. And a lot of people don't want to do the actual work that goes into that, meaning leading that lifestyle where you're doing exercise and you're eating a balanced diet, whatever that might be. They want to snap fingers and get the results. And so anytime there's an offer of that, they may jump at it.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of quick fix messaging.
In everything, not just nutrition, but in everything, right? Everybody wants the quick answer. So having said all that, we hear a lot now about, plant-based diets and animal-based diets, and, we know some of the global, climate problems that some of those things cause. But from a nutrition standpoint, do you see that there is a right and a wrong between those two, or are they both okay in certain ways, or what are your feelings on that?
I think you have to start with how do you define plant-based and how do you define animal-based, because there can be extremes on both ends. So some people with plant-based, that might mean vegan, it might mean vegetarian, it might mean flexitarian, pescatarian.
Yeah.
You can start to sort of kind of break it apart into multiple different ways of eating that are all slightly different, but might have this broad umbrella term of plant-based. Whereas animal-based, you can go all the way in the opposite extreme, where some people are eating just meat. Some people, maybe it means that they're incorporating meat. So I would start with an understanding of that. And when I think of plant-based, I think of majority plants. That doesn't mean only plants. To me, plant-based means that you are more aligned with like the flexitarian eating approach, where you might incorporate animal products, but you have majority plants on the plate. And most of the diet patterns and healthy ways of eating within populations, so you think about the Mediterranean diet as an example, it is mostly plant-based. And there might be some animal products of minimal quantities included there, but we know that the Mediterranean eating pattern can have positive health benefits. So the same might go for something like a DASH diet, which is the dietary approaches to stopping hypertension. That's something that could also incorporate animals, that is a healthy eating pattern, incorporates mostly plants, and that can have positive health benefits. So, you know, I don't really prescribe to one or the other. I don't recommend one or the other for a blanket approach for anyone. However, most Americans are not getting enough fruits and vegetables. Most people are not eating enough plants. And I do think that there is a significant health impact when you don't get enough, and you can see a lot of benefits to adding in more plants. So, you know, I probably would lean more towards that recommendation of wanting to say that the plant-based approach, with knowing that animals can still be a part of that if you choose to have them in your diet, then, you know, that's going to have probably the most significant health impact.
Right. Yeah. And that, you know, just for myself, that's kind of where I am with, it's mostly plant-based. Occasionally there will be some animal, you know, product in there, but, it's working. I feel better with it. I feel good with it. So, you know, I'm going with it.
Yeah.
Until I see the next news flash. No, I'm kidding. You know, I'm not going to follow the headlines. So
Yeah,
obviously you've taken your field and you've kind of gone into working with athletes, especially like in the endurance field.
yeah.
So talk to us a little bit about, you know, diet and nutrition for sports specific, and how do you, you know, what is your formula for working with athletes to, you know, for optimal performance?
Yeah. So it's really not unlike what you would recommend for a lot of individuals when it comes to healthy eating. There's definitely approaches within sports nutrition that are around the timing of nutrients, ensuring that you're getting plenty of specific nutrients during endurance training, especially. So like carbohydrate intake and staying hydrated, of course, key, and electrolyte intake, etc. But when it comes to the majority of your diet, one thing, especially in the population that I usually work with, which is the amateur athlete, someone who is more along the lines of an endurance fitness enthusiast who's doing marathons or half Ironmans or Ironman races, but not necessarily an elite athlete. We're talking about people who are maybe training for 5 to 10% of their life, but the other 95 to 90% of their time, they're just like you and I, and they need to eat a healthy diet that supports them every day, not just during those endurance events. So with that comes a lot of focus on making sure that you're eating plenty of plants, that you're getting all of the antioxidants and minerals and vitamins that go along with eating all of the fruits and vegetables, and you're getting in the whole grains, and then focusing on those quality sources of protein, as well as ensuring that you're getting the hydration in there and the adequate amount of fats as well. So, you know, I think that it isn't a one size fits all approach. There's definitely modifications depending on the person's preferences and energy needs and, you know, access and ability to prepare foods. But a lot of those common themes really do come with making sure that they're meeting their energy needs and that they're getting a variety in the diet to help to increase the nutrient diversity, focusing on minimally processed where possible, because, you know, we know that there's benefits to that as well, especially when it comes to just satisfaction and the way that meals help you feel when you're eating them. When you're eating minimally processed can be definitely have a benefit to just keeping you full for longer, and then also ensuring that you're meeting your nutrient needs. That's from a macronutrient and micronutrient standpoint. So It's definitely something that it would be a very similar approach to what just the everyday person walking around would need to eat too, with the exception of timing the nutrients appropriately for endurance training and ensuring the energy needs are met, because that can be a significant piece. When you start to increase the hours that you're training, you're definitely going to be burning more calories, obviously, so it can be more difficult to meet those needs.
Yeah. So we work with, this podcast is called The Elite Athlete. Obviously, we work with a lot of elite athletes. We have a lot of elite athletes on here. And what I mean by elite athletes are folks that, are generally training for some goal, some level, whether it's, a wrestler trying to be a national champion, or, someone trying to make it into the WNBA or the NBA or whatever it might be. When you do work with folks like that, or even when you work with folks in the more, like you said, in the more normal lifestyle, but they're doing endurance sports, what are some of the things that you use to evaluate a person's nutrition, when they come to see you or they speak with you, and that you use to guide them along the path of kind of, improving their nutrition and optimizing, again, for the performance?
Yeah, I often will start with, I have to understand what is currently happening in the diet. So that does involve some form of tracking. It might not be a calorie tracking app per se, but like a recall or any kind of just journal, food journal, so that you can really share where are we today? What are we currently working with? And then also understanding what are the challenges. So how is performance going? Do you feel like you have the energy to complete your workouts at the intensity that you plan to complete them? Do you have an injury? Is there anything significant going on that could be impacting your nutrient needs? Are you currently skipping out on specific food groups? So have you cut out food groups, or are there those that you maybe have an allergy or an intolerance to that could be impacting your nutrient needs? So really understanding what is the state of the situation today with those types of questions, understanding what the diet is, and then taking a look at that from a nutrient perspective and calorie needs. Weight modification plays a significant role in this too, because if somebody has seen a change in weight, intentional or not, then that is telling you something about energy intake. And so looking at where we are today and then making appropriate modifications from there, depending on the answers to all of those questions. So I like to start with that awareness piece before moving into any kind of nutrition education or modification to the diet, and then understanding how we can develop a plan together to what is going to be the most appropriate for you moving forward. So do we need to make significant changes to the diet, or is it more about the quantity of the foods that you're currently eating, or is it more about the timing of those foods? And then how is that going to impact? And let's circle back and reevaluate what that looks like when we do make these changes together, so that then you can see what's working, what isn't working. And it's this process of continually moving through those steps to determine what the final plan would be for you, depending on where you are in your training. So that's also going to change a lot of things too. If you start to have significant modifications in training, maybe it's training for a new endurance race, or maybe it is a time frame where you have a lull in training and you need to adjust your nutrient needs because of that. That's something else that I will help with as well. Then we look at what are the modifications that need to happen because of those things too. But I cannot help somebody with their diet and their performance fueling if I don't know what they're currently doing and what it looks like today, and what they believe is working now, and what isn't working. That the person who is experiencing it, the athlete, I have the information, of course, to help them, but the athlete is the expert in themselves and how they feel. Yeah. And so that's an essential part of the conversation. And sometimes, you'll work with somebody, and I think athletes are different because they kind of innately know they have to be transparent. they have to share the information, but sometimes it requires building that trust and really breaking down some of that communication barrier to help them know that you can share whatever needs to be shared with me. This is the only way that I'm going to be able to help you, is by sharing this information, and let's figure out what's working together and then moving forward from there.
So it sounds like, you know, it comes down to what really feels best for the athlete or the person. Are there those certain, you know, medical indications or markers that you use? Like, you know, do you track blood pressure, for example, or you know, sugar levels in someone's, you know, do you do any of those testing, or is that just really only if there's an issue that you want to look at?
Yeah, so usually with the population that I work with, I'm not tracking that information. If somebody's come to me with a significant health concern and then they're looking to start being more active or start a fitness regimen that then will help them ultimately with the health outcome, then that is when that will come into play. But at least in the population that I work with, those kinds of metabolic measurements aren't really a part of what I do. Right. But that's not unlikely at all, especially as you get into more elite and professional sports, because the time that somebody is actually spending doing whatever the training might be, and then those health measurement and outcomes, that's at a core component to that. And I think, you know, your population, as it changes with who you're working with, those measurements and fine tuning become so much more significant to performance, especially at the professional level. When you're competing against people who are also with, you know, the same elite level, where any little modification to diet, to sleep, to recovery, all of those things will have a significant impact. And even if it's just, you know, seconds of the time, you know, that would come off of a event or a race as a result.
Yeah. So one of the big questions that, you know, again, athletes are always looking at, and again, the general population probably as well, is, you know, eating routines as well. Like, how often do I eat? You know, some athletes eat as much as 7 times a day, small meals. You know, what is a recommendation for you when you're dealing with these endurance athletes? And do you have is it preference of what each person has, or do you have a kind of more of a common recommendation for what works best?
Yeah, well, spacing out, especially nutrients when it comes to working around training schedules, that's key. So as an example, some popular diets, like with intermittent fasting as an example, is something that comes up sometimes.
That was my next question.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Fasting.
So focusing on nutrient timing with a diet approach like that is key, because if you have a fasting window that also happens to be within the time frame that you are doing maybe a longer endurance training session, then that might negatively impact your performance. I mean, we know that from the research that, yes, training in instances where you have lower carbohydrate quantities, like a lower glycogen level of glycogen storage, that could potentially be beneficial for modifications to helping you with increasing total glycogen storage, and then also getting better with fat utilization and that sort of thing. However, we also know that eating carbohydrates prior to endurance training can have a significant impact on perceived effort and intensity, and glycogen is the #1 storage of glucose fuel source that you're going to be using during endurance exercise. So for the person that I would work with, I'm not necessarily pushing that they're training at a low carbohydrate intake or on a low carbohydrate diet. That's not really something that I would recommend. So that's a little bit of an aside to your original question, which really is just around with the nutrient timing. And so that's going to play a role in how often I would recommend that somebody is eating when it comes to when they're actually training. So making sure that we're timing that correctly. But then also, what does their daily life allow? and are we meeting energy needs with the way that they're eating now? So if that means that we need to break it up into smaller meals and snacks, then I would definitely recommend that if it means that that's the only way we're going to meet energy needs. If, you know, the traditional 3 meals, 1 or 2 snacks a day is going to work, we're going to meet energy needs, we're going to be timing the nutrients adequately for your training, and you're also spreading that protein intake throughout the day, and we're, you know, checking all the boxes from a nutrition standpoint, then that's fine as well. I don't think there is a single right answer on this one. But I will say sometimes, like with plant-based diets, just to kind of go back to that, the quantity of food that you need to eat to meet your energy needs can sometimes be pretty significant when you're talking about eating higher fiber, higher water foods. So like fruits and vegetables and beans and that sort of thing. So when you have the greater volume of those foods, then sometimes it can be a challenge to meet energy needs and total calorie needs. So that's where it becomes really important to spread out the meals a little bit more too, because the quantity would be smaller, and then you can meet those energy needs with multiple meals throughout the day. So it really would depend. You know, it's not like I could say that you should be eating six small meals a day. You know, it's not really always that straightforward.
Understood. You mentioned a little earlier about tailoring, you know, or changing diets based on, you know, whether someone's in a training regimen for a race or for an event or an athletic performance, and then changing that a little bit when they're kind of out of season, or do you make modifications, you know, pre-competition, post-competition, off-season, kind of things like that? Is that something that you would structure with your people you work with?
Yeah, so I tend to use like plate models pretty regularly, just the basic athlete plate mentality. So that would be just a healthy eating plate of having fruits and vegetables be the majority of what you're eating. You have the whole grains being a source, or starchy vegetables for carbohydrates, and then you're getting the protein, or not necessarily, depends on the person. Sometimes you break it down into a little bit more of the macronutrients, but that visual can be beneficial for somebody at the amateur level to really help with just kind of visualizing what the total eating pattern should look like throughout the day or throughout the week. And then making modifications to that depending on intensity or hours spent training. So you might see that somebody who has more training scheduled for, let's say, a longer session on a weekend day, then you're definitely going to need to increase your energy intake and probably carbohydrate intake for sure, as a result, just to help with replacing glycogen that was used during the longer session. So the plates tend to be a good visual for that, because it can help you with just thinking about the way that the pattern shifts based off of your training. Most of the time, when you start looking at things where you're reducing total hours spent training, then that you need to make modifications to energy intake. And I like to do this in a way where, you know, you're adding in foods and you're still providing volume, and you're still thinking about the colors on the plate and all of the basics around healthy eating. Because, you know, really, if we have a diet that is going back to focusing on the mostly plants, and you have the protein sources that are from, whether it's plant-based or animal-based proteins, then when you start to think about modifying energy total quantities that you're consuming, I don't necessarily want somebody to turn to calorie tracking for that. That's not my goal for most of the people that I work with. I think it's really important to think about eating to satisfaction and making sure that you are listening to the hunger cues as well, and being able to do so in a way that's sustainable for you. And that just might mean making slight modifications to what you're choosing to add to your diet, and focusing in a little bit more on getting those fruits and vegetables and the leaner sources of protein, you know, versus needing to pump up the total calories and the carbs after longer sessions. So those adjustments, I think, to the eating pattern can be very beneficial just for the longevity of the way somebody's eating, you know, because the last thing that I ever want is for somebody to go on to like a specific diet for a short period of time and not be able to sustain that.
Right.
That's not going to have a positive impact.
Yep. Yep. So, you know, I know that this is probably not an area of expertise for you, but I'll ask anyway. So we, you know, we work with a lot of wrestlers. I'm a wrestling coach, you know, and that's a big part of our audience is wrestlers, MMA people. Do you have any, and everybody's always looking for the advice on how to, you know, control weight control, how to weight control, or sometimes it's called cutting weight, you know, how do we cut weight the most effective way? And again, like we talked about in the beginning of this session, even those athletes are looking for the shortcuts and looking for the easy way to do that. And we know there are none, but do you have any advice for anyone in that level, in that, you know, arena?
Yeah, I think, well, first, definitely going about it and being committed to going about it in a healthy way. So like you said, and this is something I know that we talked about briefly previously, is just modifying your water intake or creating an environment in yourself where you're just ultimately dehydrated. That's not a healthy approach, right? So while you might see a change in weight with hydration status modification, that's not going to be sustainable. It's not a true change in body composition. So it can also have negative and very dangerous, in some cases, impact. So I would say having the commitment to doing it in a way that is healthy and sustainable is number one. And along with that comes patience, and also being persistent and making sure that you are, you know, committed to an approach that has your long-term health in mind. Because I know competition is immediate and it's the thing that's right in front of you and it's the goal that you have set, but we all have to remember that we're also, you know, humans that need to live long, healthy lives, and so we can do lasting damage if we are, you know, not treating our bodies properly, and cutting weight in extreme and restrictive ways can be very negative for our long-term health. So that's the first thing I'll say. The second is I would be realistic about what your weight can actually safely be. And I think, you know, thinking about body fat percentage is really important. So males and females have minimums when it comes to body fat percentage. And if you're accurately measuring that, then that's something that I would pay attention to, especially, you know, for both males and females. It's incredibly important to make sure that you're not going to an extreme body fat percentage that is too low for you. I would say it's, you know, probably unlikely in most cases, but some people can get to a percentage that is unhealthy. We're meant to have some fat, and it's required for a lot of reasons for our health. So keeping that in mind. And then, you know, from there, I would say that it's thinking about when you're actually timing this decision to cut weight. So weight loss itself is not going to guarantee and improve performance. Like, there's nothing that says that if you are a specific weight, you are guaranteed to be a better athlete. You know, you have to think about all the things that are happening when you're losing weight. And in some instances, you can be losing lean muscle mass. And so that means you're losing power, you're losing strength, and that's not good. So working with a dietitian can help you with setting the goals and the calorie needs and the energy intake and macronutrient intake, of course, that you need to hopefully prevent a significant amount of muscle mass loss, because that's not what you want. You might see a change on the scale, but if you're not losing fat, you're losing muscle, then you're not helping your performance for sure, guaranteed. Yeah. So, and oftentimes I think, you know, some of these weight loss approaches are best done when you're not in the middle of a season or trying to compete, you know, at your max. And I know that's probably not what most people want to hear, because a lot of times, you know, you're not really thinking about it during the off season. I'm sure it's you know, not top of mind to be thinking necessarily to be thinking about being a specific weight, especially if that weight feels unsustainable to your regular life. You know, then
Yeah. And
it's a
when we're
question
talking
too.
about, you know, when we are talking about cutting weight, generally that is not a sustainable weight you're trying to get to. That's why you're cutting in the first place.
Yeah.
You're not weight controlling. And that's something that fortunately over the years, you know, the governing bodies of these different sports have recognized abuse in weight cutting and have now put in protocols that really, you know, help to manage that. And coaches have gotten wiser, and even athletes who have kind of competed have realized it wasn't the best thing for them. So it's a lot less dangerous than it used to be. Not that it still is dangerous, but there's a lot more controls around it. So it's a little harder to do that. There are people who will break the rules and bend, but for the most part, we're in a better position now than we ever have been. So, but I appreciate that advice. I think that's really good, sound information. And sometimes people forget about it and they go ahead and they do the unhealthy thing anyway, but overall, it makes a lot of sense. I had two more questions that I really wanted to get out there. And one is, a large part of our audience are younger athletes. They may be anywhere from middle school to high school and up to college. But for the middle school, for the younger, you know, 11, 12, 13-year-old, we talked a lot about diets and balancing. They don't always control their diet. You know, their parents control the diet. What are there things that they should be doing? I mean, it sounds like it's probably they should be doing the same thing as we should, right? Having a good balanced plate. But are there any things that young athletes who are beginning to shoot for that elite level, you know, and are beginning to think about training a little bit more each day or each year, are the things they should start doing now to get prepared for, you know, those next levels?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I'll be the first to say I don't work directly with adolescents,
Mm-hmm.
but I know from my experience being an adolescent athlete that there's a lot you don't have control over. I understand that, but I think that when it comes to sports, especially at any age, having the conversation with coaches, with professionals, hopefully if there's access to anybody who is a nutrition professional at that level, and then also with your parents and those who are making the food decisions, to make it more collaborative, to understand what are the needs that I have, I being the athlete, and then how can I work within my ability to make sure that I'm getting the energy needs that I'm meeting my energy needs, and that I'm getting the nutrients that I need, and it's helping to support my performance. And that might mean that, you know, there is a little bit more effort too on the athlete side to participate in the shopping, to help with coming up with recipes that they actually enjoy making, to help with making those recipes when those foods are available, you know, really playing an active role in that at home. Because yes, it's going to be helpful for your performance, but it's also building that structure that you're going to need if you want to be successful all the way through college and, you know, even professionally beyond that. Knowing how to cook good food and knowing how to put that food on your plate is a key part of being an excellent athlete and fueling yourself well. So you should start soon with that. Those skills are invaluable and they will be for the rest of your life. So I would say get involved as much as you can.
That's, you know, that's tremendous advice. You know, I often speak to my athletes. My sons were athletes for me, and also collegiate athletes in lacrosse. And I talk to them sometimes about, there's times when you have to use food for fuel and not food necessarily for, you know, the best taste in the world. But I think your advice right there, to get involved younger and learn what you really like and be able to prepare that yourself, allows to kind of marry the two, right? We can use food that we use for fuel, but we can enjoy the taste of it as well. So that was really great advice. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I guess my last question is, is more of a general question, and that is, can you give us, again, you've given us a lot of this already, and a lot of stuff you've given us that people can unpack. But if you can maybe give us 3 definite do's and 3 maybe definite don'ts when it comes to nutrition for, you know, for athletes. If, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's great. I love that question. So definite do's. I think number 1 is making sure that you have diversity in your diet. So yes, you can meet your calorie needs, let's say as an example, by eating, just an example here, by eating grilled chicken and green beans every day, maybe, right? But that lack of diversity is going to have negative consequences from a just micronutrient standpoint, but also mentally. You know, you get flavor fatigue. You're not going to be too thrilled with what you're eating after a specific period of time. And I think that's really key. So having the diversity in the diet to make sure that you're keeping the healthy food interesting and you're giving yourself a wide array of nutrients is so important. Antioxidants and phytochemicals, all the things that go along with eating, quote unquote, the rainbow, as people say. So I'd say that's number 1.
And eating the rainbow means more colors on your
Yes.
on your plate, the better it is, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's super basic, but it's really not really something that I would say the majority of people are doing well. So sometimes the simple advice is the best advice, and I would say that's a really good example of that. I think the other thing too is probably the second piece of this is not forgetting about the importance of nutrition when it comes to recovery. So recovery is a necessary part of being a great athlete, and allowing yourself that rest and ability to repair and rebuild is incredibly important to performance, and nutrition plays an important role in that. So that really involves, there's a lot of layers to that, but it involves the timing of nutrients, it involves the quantity of like things like protein, carbohydrate, that you are staying hydrated, that you are thinking about. It's not just about what you're eating before and during any kind of training, it's what you're eating after, and then the rest of the time until you go and do the next competition or the next training session. So I would say that's key too. And from a third standpoint, I think, you know, when it comes to nutrition, reducing things to just nutrients alone and forgetting about the fact that your eating pattern works together as a whole, that there's interactions amongst nutrients, that we have to consider that, you know, we can't take just everything down to a supplement or a pill, that we need to be thinking about where are we getting those things in our diet, and how is that going to help to support our performance. So, you know, examples of that really might be around things like antioxidant intake, or your protein and carbohydrate sources, you know, that you're not necessarily just getting those things in supplement form, that you're thinking about everything else that comes along with the same quantity of protein that you might get in a whole food versus what you would get just in a supplement alone. So probably the third, you know, way that I would say that would be more about thinking about the whole foods of the diet versus just the supplement piece. Supplements can have a role, but I think sometimes there's too much of an emphasis there, for sure.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And definite don'ts are really challenging. You know, I think that kind of on the flip side of what I just mentioned about the supplements is thinking about food as just calories. Don't think about food as just calories. It's way, way more than that. So you can meet your calorie needs with very just, I don't know the right word for it. You can meet your calorie needs in a lot of ways, I'll just say, with a lot of foods that might be less on the beneficial side and foods that are on the beneficial side. But when you think about them in just calories alone, then it's like one little piece of a puzzle that is not telling the full story. So don't think about foods and just calories alone. I'll leave it at that without going off on a soapbox.
And I'll help you with another don't. How's this? By asking a question. Again, especially for the high school athlete, I see so many kids going to whey protein powders or muscle milk or all these things that I personally don't believe that they need at all. They're young, growing, physically strong athletes. If they put in the work, if they eat the balanced diets, they're not going to really need those things. What is your feeling as a professional? I'm just a coach. I'm not a nutrition expert. What is your feeling about those things on an overall basis? I'm not saying some individuals may not benefit from it, but on an overall basis, what are your feelings about that?
I think they can have their place. I think sometimes they're convenient more than anything, but I would never say they're superior to natural food sources of those same nutrients. So as a general rule, engineered foods, especially in the sports world, especially in endurance sports, for sure have a place, and can, have a performance benefit in some examples. However, where we run into challenges are when we're starting to use those in place of eating a diverse diet, and we forget about the fact that something like, let's just say, a grilled chicken breast is going to have maybe the same amount of protein as like a muscle milk drink, as an example, but the satisfaction factor that comes along with eating a meal that includes plenty of protein as well as a volume of other food is going to be different than drinking the supplement that has that same quantity of protein. The other nutrients that come along within that plate of food is going to be significantly different than what you would get in a drink. And then you also have to think about like the added sugars that are included in these and some of the additional components to the supplements that aren't positive. This is a little bit of an aside, but ties into this. There was a really great study done on processed foods versus unprocessed, so ultra processed versus unprocessed, where it was one of those rare instances where they were able to take people and put them into a laboratory type environment for, I think it was a month-long experiment. They gave them the same calorie count of food, and a lot of the nutrients were the same, the fiber, protein, carbohydrate, etc. But one of the diets was a ultra processed diet and one was an unprocessed diet. And this was by definition of a scale that's used to determine which is which when it comes to the foods as far as the processing. And on the ultra processed diet, the people ate like 500 calories more per day when they were just free eating than the people on the unprocessed diet. I think that says a lot about the satiety factor of foods. And so sometimes we can't get around that. I think there's a whole nother layer of conversation around, food access and cost and ability to prepare certain foods and the time it takes to prepare foods that has to be considered when you're talking about this. But that study alone can tell us that there's something about the ultra processing that is potentially having a negative impact when it comes to just total quantity. So, getting a taste for making sure that you, are enjoying foods in their whole form and you can prepare food. This is more for like the high school athletes. But when you start thinking about what is that palette that you're building and what are you putting onto your plate and teaching yourself to enjoy, and what does that look like, and how are you actually preparing foods with whole foods that feel and taste good and can be incorporated into your diet. Again, it's all these things that will last you for a lifetime once you can get to that point to figure it out. So I think that's a big aside from what we were originally talking about, but I do think that it plays into it, because relying on just the convenience of those kind of engineered foods sometimes can have negative consequences ultimately to just, what the rest of your diet might look like.
Yeah, and so to simplify that, I mean, again, I'm going to simplify it. Ultra processed foods, probably a don't.
Yeah, right? I would say so. I mean, especially if we can say that we're allowing space for that if it's the only option available, you know, like I think we have to be careful to make sure that if somebody doesn't have access to the unprocessed source, then that might play a role in their decision and definitely can have its place. I would much rather somebody meet their nutrient energy needs with whatever food is available versus not eating enough, right? But yeah, I'd say on a whole, if I had to have a don't, it's going to be trying to limit a lot of those ultra processed foods for sure.
And while we were speaking before, you made me think of something else, another question that's a little bit unrelated, but I think you might be able to speak to it too. The use of energy drinks, you know, the Red Bulls and the other things that seem to, that kids seem to think are helping. What's your feeling on those type of things?
I don't recommend them. Yeah. I mean,
I don't. There's a don't.
It's a don't. It's definitely a don't. I think, especially with a lot of the high caffeine quantities, some of them are very high in added sugar. Some of them also have additional compounds. I've seen some with things like creatine added. You know, I think we need to be careful there of trying, and not necessarily that creatine is an issue per se. I'm just saying that when we start to stack all of these things together, if we're drinking multiple of these beverages, and they all have the extreme quantities of different nutrients, like different vitamins and minerals, and they also have a lot of added sugar, and they also have a lot of caffeine. I mean, you could really easily get pretty high quantities in total if you're drinking multiple in a day. So I would just be an educated consumer, read the labels, know the why for choosing these things. I think that's really key. And also, you have to remember the front of a package is it's like a billboard, right? It's marketing for the product. So what you really need to be looking at is that nutrition facts panel, the ingredient list, and then asking the important questions to educate yourself on what are these things actually doing? Is there research to back them up? And can I get this from food? And if I can, why am I not getting it from food? And if I can't, then is this quantity actually going to be beneficial for me in what my ultimate performance goal is? And does the research actually support that?
Yeah, and I can just speak from experience and watching it. I've never yet seen anyone who's intaking that optimize their performance. I've seen it negatively affect them in many situations. Never seen it be a positive for them. So, for whatever that's worth, from experience, I've seen that. So, there's a don't for us.
Yes, I like that one. That's a good one.
Yeah, so we've got a bunch of do's, we got a bunch of don'ts, and listen, this has been really informative, and I think it's a really great beneficial conversation to have, and I appreciate your time with us, and want to thank you so much. How can people get a hold of you or follow you and learn more about what you're doing?
Yeah, so I am on all of the social media, I feel like at this point. Instagram is Endurance Sports Nutritionist. I have a website, anewwell.co. So that's ANEWWELL.co.
Get that second W in there.
Yes, exactly. 2 W's.
Yeah.
And then I'm on Twitter as well at Allison Knott RD. And you can email me, allison@anewwell.co. So lots of different ways that you can get in touch. Probably the most active on Instagram. I have a Facebook page as well. So if you search for A New Well Sports Nutrition, you can find me there too.
For all of our athletes that listen, none of them are on Facebook anymore. So we'll tell them to go after Instagram and find you other ways. And I love it. It's Newell with 2 W's and no M, right? It's
yes.
.co, not M. So I think the first time kind of.
I like to keep it complicated.
Yeah, it's really simple, but yeah, I made a mistake the first time. Again, Allison, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I really appreciate it, and we'll see you on social media, and we'll be following you, and we appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a good night.
Take care now.
Thanks. Bye.